Eric Ketelaar is Professor Emeritus of the University of Amsterdam. Between 1998 and 2009 was Professor of Archive in Mass Communication Department in the Amsterdam University. He has done a lot of research, particularly focused on social and cultural context of documentation creation and its use. He has written many papers. I would like to actually recommend to you lots of books as well, and the most recent one is Archiving People, a Social History of Arts Archive, which can be downloaded on the internet. He's been General Archivist of the State up until the year 1997, and also in the History Department of the University of Leiden. He worked between, we apologize, but we lost sound, all the way up to 2002. So we have a lot more information. His track record is truly a vast and wide one. But for starters, I would like to say that at the committee, we totally agreed in inviting him. And we wanted him to start the session in the morning devoted to archiving. We have split up the morning. It's archiving in the morning and exhibition in the afternoon. He is an archivist. He has worked in the postmodern archivist. He talks about archivists and does, or actually states a difference there. And he performs lots of reflections that really fitted in the way we classify them as well. And he has Art Archive. This is his speech. I'm not going to translate that because I think he himself is going to speak about the translation, which can be a bit ambiguous. So you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
Indeed, the title of my intervention is, the title in English at least, is ambiguous. Is it, in English, is archive a verb or a noun? Should there be an exclamation mark after archive? You should archive art. Or should one put a hyphen between art and archive, meaning that there is a special category of artistic endeavor which we may call archive art? And why archive and not archives, plural, the singular and the plural? In contemporary art, the archive has become the dominant symbolic and cultural form, to quote Ernst van Alphen, who wrote Staging the Archive, about art and photography in the age of new media. It is a superb book, and I urge you to read it, along with Preserving and Exhibiting Media Art, edited by Julia Noordegraaf and others. Last year, Anne Callahan published her book Archive, Art plus Archive, Understanding the Archival Turn in Contemporary Art, in which she explores the specific functions the notion of archive has in the field of contemporary art. These and more publications, Callahan provides a very useful inventory of the discourse since the 1990s about archive art, but any discourse, all those books don't deplete the discourse, because any discourse benefits from participation by people from different backgrounds. They say that where you stand on art or on any issue depends a lot where you sit. Van Alphen is Professor of Literary Studies. Noordegraaf is Professor of Heritage and Digital Culture. Callahan, an art historian. I am a user of archives and museums and libraries, a regular visitor of museums, and a collector of modern art. But professionally, I am an archivist, engaged in theory, scholarship, methodology and practice of archivistics, also known as archival science. I study the characteristics of archives in their social and cultural contexts and how they are created, used, abused, selected and transferred through time. In art, as in many other domains, an archival turn has led to using archives as a methodological lens to analyze entities and processes, quite often under the rubric of de-archive, rather than archives plural. Unlike many archivists, I wouldn't make a fuss over the difference between the singular and the plural. Archives and archive are boundary objects which straddle many different communities of practice. Any given object could be claimed by two or more communities. Callahan borrows from Mieke Bal, another Dutchman, the notion of a traveling concept, explaining the archive means and does something quite different in the field of art than it does when it circulates in, say, literature or philosophy. So don't fight about archive and archives. Both artists and archivists, as well as the public at large, could benefit from exploring and comprehending what is lost or gained in the translation from the ontological and epistemological archive or archives into a quasi-archival logic. Such comprehension is essential in designing policies and practices for archiving living works of art. As a starting point for an exploration of de-archive and archives in art, I quote from the introduction of the recent book Artists in the Archive. The editors, Paul Clark, Simon Jones, and Nick Kay, and Johanna Linsky, start the introduction by stating, "To archive is to give place, order and future in the remainder, to consider things, including documents, as reiterations to be acted upon, as potential evidence for historians yet to be completed. The archive," they state, "is never static nor simply pertains to the past. Archives are comprised in their continuing and future enactment and use in layers of performance." This seems to suggest that the object of archiving is a remainder, that what is left, either by chance or on purpose. However, archiving encompasses more. In my field, archives mean the whole of information received, created and maintained as evidence and of as an asset by an organization or person in pursuance of legal obligations or in the interest of its own purposes and the business, regardless of medium, form or format. Many archivists distinguish between active records, documentos de archivo activos, on the one hand created and used in the course of business, and on the other hand historical archives, records to be kept beyond their primary purpose. This distinction, however, has little relevance, especially in the digital age. Archival documents are created, recreated, reiterated, used and reused recursively in a continuum from their first capture in what archivists call a record-keeping system to their management in an archive and to pluralization into the wider world. Recorded information as the sediment of a specific activity or transaction must be regarded as archival documents from the very beginning. Unlike mere data, archives are transactional and process-bound information. That is, the information is generated by coherent work processes and structured and recorded by these work processes in such a way that it can be retrieved from the context of those work processes. Consequently, We do not consider the record or document merely on its own, but within the context of the work process which created the document, and which gives each document its specific meaning within that context. Archiving includes creating and linking a document to a transaction and to the other documents of that transaction by some form of physical or virtual filing. The archival bond, or the interrelatedness between the records created and received in the course of a particular transaction, is an essential characteristic of archives. Archiving, therefore, is not limited to filing and preservation, but implies record keeping from the very decision to create and use documents for a transaction. Archiving is a cultural, social and political practice influenced by societal challenges and by technologies, not directly, but through the agency of actors who act in a function executing specific work processes according to a mandate and the actor's functions. In my book Archive of People, it was just mentioned, I proposed this model of the archival context. For example, we acknowledge the need felt by society for an armed force that is anchored constitutionally. That's the mandate. Why? This results in functions, what, performed by actors who, in specific work processes, how, where and when, in specific work processes they work. All this leads to archiving. Each of these interdependent components is time and place bound and influenced by technology. The changing views of society, however, about military service, as an example, changing views have an influence on the military's mandate and subsequently on the functions, the enlisting system, actors like governments and citizens and businesses, and work processes, leading to changes in archiving. In the opening sentence of Artists in the Archive, Clarke and his fellow editors state, "The archive is to give place, order and future." I like this triad of place, order and future. These processes, however, do not happen on their own, but are conceived and implemented by human and non-human actors. Any archive is constructed and reconstructed in a dynamic network of human and non-human agents. These agents shape the archive and are shaped by the archive. This is the duality of archiving, which I have dealt with before, 5 years ago, in a lecture at the Palau de la Verena here in Barcelona. A Portuguese version of the speech is available since 2021. Giving place is linked to what Jacques Derrida calls consignation. He wrote, "There's no archive without consignation in an external place, which assures the possibility of memorization, of repetition, of reproduction, or of reimpression." Place or space and consignation are essential. You need the space for storage and the mechanism for placing memories in the store correctly and for getting these back clearly and in a usable form. Duchamp, Boltanski, Warhol and many other artists were and are fascinated by the storage of archive. The first great exhibition of archive art in 1997 in Munich and later on other places, other locations like New York, for instance, at the MoMA. That first exhibition was called Deep Storage. However, storage of archives is not an end by itself. Archiving is more than storage and more than merely accumulating documents. The other two elements of the triad, order and future, are essential too. In ordering and arranging archives, archivists try to restore, to the extent possible, the original order of the archives, that is, the organically grown order originally applied by the creator, in the archives context. Archivists reject replacing the original order by an artificial classification. For example, chronological or alphabetical, or following the Dewey Decimal classification, which is used by many libraries. Because replacing the original order would affect the evidential value of the archives. Of course, when such an artificial order or classification has been used by the creator, him or herself, then the archives should be arranged by the archivists accordingly. Restoring the original order more or less exactly is not always feasible, and often the archivist is confronted with the disorderly accumulation of documents which have to be put in order. In such cases, ordering archives becomes an interpretive and creative act which effectively shapes the archives. According to Ernst van Alphen, when archival practices in modern art demonstrate the Foucauldian order of things, it is usually through presenting a deviant order. Most archivists wouldn't accept such a deviant order, overlooking the fact that their order may be just as idiosyncratic and constructed as the one designed by the artist. The difference between perceptions of organically grown and artificially constructed has often been invoked to draw the line between archives and collections, and between archivists and librarians. Collection has been haunting archival practitioners and theorists ever since the respect des fonds was formulated in 1841 and codified in the Dutch Manual for the Arrangement and Description of Archives of 1898. The core idea of the manual was that an archive is not so much an arbitrary collection, but a whole that has arisen organically. Archives, according to the manual, are the reflection of the creator's functions, and therefore not arbitrarily created in the way that historical manuscripts are accumulated. The difference between organically grown archives and artificially constructed collections is effectively deconstructed by James Currell, Michael Moss and Susan Stewart in two articles published in 2005 and 2006. They argue that all collections in archives, libraries and museums are constructed and mediated. The creators of a collection privilege some items to be part of the aggregation and reject, often implicitly, others. In my country, as in other countries, text messages sent and received by phone by public officials are considered to be archival documents. Very recently it became known that the Dutch Prime Minister used to select from the text messages he received and sent on his phone the important ones. The rest he deleted every day from his phone, apparently assuming that the latter were not archival. In creating his archives, he thus privileged some text messages while rejecting others, putting some on the archival pedestal, sending others into oblivion. Accepting the constructed nature of collections and archives should not lead to lumping them together. The logic of the archives acknowledges that records and archives are process-bound information. This is different from the logic of libraries and documentation centers that acquire and preserve books and other media not created and kept as evidence of a business work process. Place, order, future. What future do archives have? The introduction of artists in the archive states that documents are reiterations to be acted upon, and they state, the archive is never static. These are very important statements, acknowledging that archival documents are, as Sue McCamish once wrote, always in a state of becoming. They are just as performative as artistic performances, having no definable end. Digital records especially are inherently performative, only coming into existence when the correct code executes the data to render a meaningful output. But neither are archival documents, on paper or digital, static at all. They are dynamic, even when they are seemingly frozen in time. The processes of giving place, order and future are not neutral or objective. Rather, they are situated within specific social, cultural, professional, institutional and individual objects. Archives are produced from culturally embedded expectations and conventions. For example, slave registers in the Americas didn't include birth, not out of carelessness, neither to keep them secret or for ideological reasons, but simply because registration was considered to make sense only when it was sufficiently certain that the child would remain alive. In the New World, the colonizing powers had different cultural definitions of basic economic interest. Taxing land, the English, or taxing people, the Spanish, or trading goods, the Dutch. These factors caused the creation of different types of records. Survey maps by the English, the Spanish created censuses, the Dutch commercial data. These different record types reinforced the limited colonial gaze which focused on either land or people or goods. The archives are indeed not only a social and cultural but also a political phenomenon. Because, as James Scott writes in Seeing Like a State, there are virtually no other facts for the state than those that are contained in documents. An archival document, while traveling throughout the continuum, is created and recreated, getting different meanings along the way. The authorial meaning can be overgrown by all the subsequent interactions, interventions, interrogations, translations, interpretations, mediations and appropriations. Even concealing and even destroying archives is paradoxically an activation of the archive, as for example became clear in Guatemala with the implications of the hidden police archives, or East Germany, where the pure knowledge, or rather the assumption that the Stasi was keeping records, affected people's behavior. With each of these activations of the archive, of the record, someone tells a story, adding to the document's ever-expanding semantic genealogy, a concept I introduced in 2001 in an article, Tacit Narratives, The Meanings of Archives. Each activation is an instantiation of finding meaning, making meaning, constructing meaning. And those meanings help the user, the reader or the viewer in structuring and restructuring the relationship between the self and the world, and thereby in the formation of identity. But that presupposes that earlier activations of the artifact, which I have called the tacit narratives, are knowable, retrievable and transparent. One has to look for what Heather McNeil calls archivality, which refers to the acts of continuous and discontinuous change that transform the meaning and authenticity of a font, an archive, as it is transmitted over time and space. I would argue that the same applies to artworks, especially, but not solely, net art, performances and installations. Archival documents, as the editors of artists in the archive state, serve as potential evidence for histories yet to be completed. The archive is never static or simply pertains it to the past. Indeed, archiving is not about history, but about the future, about transmitting evidence of human activity and experience through time. Archives, libraries, museums are all in the memory business, ensuring time future contained in time past, to quote the poet T.S. Eliot. But what distinguishes archives from all other memory institutions is that the individual, organizational and collective memories they preserve are not defined in terms of a cultural heritage. They are situated on the evidential axis of the records continuum. Records embody the nexus between evidence, accountability and memory. Without evidence, no accountability and no memory. Accountability and memory reside in records because records are evidence, not only evidence of transactions, not only evidence in the legal sense, they are also evidence of some historic fact, embodied in the record, or in the context of the archiving. Records serve as evidence of transaction, and records serve as evidence in an external, corporate or individual memory. Both are evidence, with one side supporting accountability and the other memory. To understand archives as a social, cultural and political phenomenon, as epistemological sites, one has to know the why, the what, the who and how in order to assess which reality may be reflected in the archives. One has to look up from the document, look through and beyond the document, to the archiving context, or rather contexts plural. The South African archivist Vern Harris calls this, I quote, an ever-unfolding horizon of contexts, an incessant movement of continual recontextualization. These contexts are shaping the action of the people and institutions who made and maintained the records. Archival documents don't speak of their own accord, but of course they have something to tell, they have a meaning. They are a repository of meanings, folded in layers of performance, as the introduction of artists in the archive state. Many people take the meaning of an artifact for granted. It has created intentionally to hold meaning by the artist, by the author. The author of creator has meant something when he or she wrote the document, sculpted the object, painted the painting. But by the very act of authoring, they have relinquished their controlling presence. They cannot control what readers and viewers make out of the artifact. The recipient assigns a meaning while viewing and reading the artifact in a particular context, time and space. And Riney, in writing about the dynamic turn in memory studies, argues meaning as such is never fixed once and for all, but is something that happens in the way events, texts and other culture products are appropriated over and over again, always with a difference. However, the meaning of a record or of any other culture artifact may be understood in two different ways. The meaning of the object and the meaning for someone or for an occasion. The first views the meaning of the archival document or object as in objectivist terms, as the idea in Platonic terms of that document, which can be inferred from the document by whoever approaches it. The latter, the other side, recognizes in subjectivist terms that information resources do not have a meaning, but that different meanings are assigned to the same resource by different people at different times. And there is a wonderful book by Philippe Artière, who is here, Le Dossier Bertrand, where he proves how one single file read by different historians creates different stories and different meanings. Resources, they don't have meanings, but they are assigned. Meaning is something made, not found. Any user, by assigning a meaning to a document, can find uses by assigning a meaning that no creator, collector, archivist or curator ever imagined. Finding meaning in archival documents looks like mere information retrieval, and the acquisition of knowledge, thus a cognitive art. Equally important, however, are what psychologists call the affective and cognitive modes of meaning construction. In their classic book, The Meaning of Things, psychologist Csikszentmihalyi and sociologist Robert Helton show that how people in dealing with objects, furniture, art, photos, books, musical instruments, papers, they define who they are or have been or want to be. Show me your sitting room or your kitchen and I tell you who you are. In the affective mode, someone pays attention to an object and selects it from the environment. Such attention and affection for an object can bring someone in a state of flow, finding great satisfaction in interacting with the object. Records are affectively charged objects, argues Katie Michel Carbone. The cognitive mode of constructing meaning refers to the outcome of the cognitive information retrieval and the affective attention. It is the intentions, the purpose, the goal which the user or viewer sees reflected in the meaning of the object. The outcome of, for example, looking at old family photos and heirlooms may be the confirmation and reinforcement of the family relations and the continuity through the generations. Distinguishing, but not always separating, cognition, emotion and motivation may help professionals in their mediation when they should be equally hospitable to emotion and motivation as they normally are to cognition. The editors of artists in the archive define, as I said before, archiving as giving place, order and future to the remainder. Indeed, archives are a residue. At every stage in the continuum, someone has to take decisions like which traces are documented, which documents become archival documents by capture in a record-keeping system, which archival documents cross the functional boundaries of the organization and of the self in order to provide collective memories, which archival documents are selected and deemed worthy of transfer to archives with a capital A. Archiving entails appraisal, that is distinguishing records of continuing value from those of no further value so that the latter may be eliminated. Appraisal is one of those interventions which co-determine the meaning of archives, because the archives after appraisal are not the same as the archives before appraisal. In the digital age, the appraisal process begins with the design of the record-keeping system, when one determines which documents are captured, that is, accepted by the system, and thus becoming records. Moreover, digital records cannot be left on the shelves for years, waiting to be appraised. And therefore, at the front end, one has to decide which records have to be kept in the system and which records can be disposed of at some later stage, either through destruction or by transferring them to another archival system. Archiving by design means that when designing the information systems that support work processes, one has to take into account the sustainability of the information from the work processes. Jeffrey Yeo characterizes archival documents, records, as persistent representations of activities created by participants or observers of those activities or by their authorized proxies. Persistence in the sense that they endure beyond the temporal ending of the activities they represent. They represent activities or actions that took place within a reality as perceived or constructed by the creator of the archives. For example, judicial archives present the world as seen by each of the parties in a lawsuit. Financial records serve to make reality calculable. And government records on people serve to make people legible as citizen and taxpayer. As the culture entrepreneur Jorge Bleasco warns, archiving systems have been modeling ways of representing reality, looking at reality, and very often have built and designed reality itself. Historians and other users of archives have to depart from the reality as perceived or constructed by the creator, and then to use their imagination to reconstruct the historical reality. This entails shifting emphasis from the analysis of the properties and characteristics of the individual documents to an analysis of the functions, processes and transactions which cause documents to be created. In this vision, call it the postmodern vision, the provenance of archives is linked to functions and activities rather than to structure and place. Archives are traditionally seen as the end of a cycle or as the final stage of a record's life, the tomb of the trace. This has been challenged by the proponents of the records continuum model, where archival documents travel back and forth in a recursive process across 4 dimensions: creation, capture, organization and pluralization, that is, making records available to society. This is different in the so-called life cycle model, where archives pass through 3 successive phases: active, semi-active and non-active. That is, however, both models are creator-centric, concentrating on the production of documents, neglecting their reception and exploitation by users. Allow me a personal note here. In 1997, the chair of archivistics at the University of Amsterdam was transferred from the history department to book, library and information studies, which was then renamed into library, archives and information studies. In vain, I proposed to have archives at the front, at the beginning. The latter two, so archives and information studies, were subsequently moved to the newly created Department of Media Studies. And there I discovered from colleagues how colleagues from television, film, journalism and new media were primarily interested in the reception of media and the interaction with readers and viewers more than in the production. And that opened my eyes to paying more attention in archival studies to the co-creator roles of the user. Recently, Anne Klein, professor at the Laval University in Quebec in Canada, has proposed a Copernican turn in archival theory and practice. She states archives become truly archives only through their use, their utilization. She advocates rethinking archives from the point of view of their exploitation rather than from their production. And she amends the records continuum model I just showed by adding exploitation as the 5th dimension. For artists, this may not be as groundbreaking as it is for archivists. Anne Klein argues that artists, since Duchamp, have developed a reciprocal relation with the public that participates in the creation of the work of art, especially in installation art. For archives too, as I said, every use is an activation of the record, adding to its tacit narratives. The proposal to bring the exploitation of archives and thus the user of archives to the forefront is in line with other recent paradigmatic changes in archival theory, methodology and practice. One is labeled Archives 2.0, an approach in which archivists use technology to become more user-centered. Another is the move towards archival autonomy. This is a concept recently proposed by Australian scholars, being the ability for individuals and communities to participate in social memory with their own voice, becoming participatory agents in record keeping and archiving. These agents are what I have called archivers, archivarios. Archivarios are not only archiveros, but also authors, clerks, registrars, antiquarians, record managers, keepers, website builders, genealogists, historians, and other users. Each acts in his or her own turn in cultural practices of creation, classification, filing, arrangement, exploitation, and most importantly, appraisal. Many installations and other artworks concentrate on the archivist as the most important actor. However, each archiver participates in the recursive production and mediation of the archives. Nevertheless, the responsibilities are not the same. The archivist's first loyalty is to the archive. No one else cares for the archive as an end, which is different from using archives as a means, as most, if not all, other archivers do. No one else is the advocate ensuring the integrity of the archive. Involvement in Klein's fifth dimension of exploitation is important, but can only be successful if there exists a record. Archivists have to be involved at the inception of the record, in the first dimension of the record continuum, to ensure it gets a place and consignation, and to safeguard its survival and exploitation throughout the continuum. To quote Jacques Derrida once more, there is no archive without the signature of the archivists. By signature of the archivist, I, Jacques Derrida, don't mean the individual signature of the person in charge, but the signature of the apparatus, the people, and the institution which produces the archive. The signature is a language, the language of the archivist. Unlike the museum curator or the librarian, whose influence on the structure and context of the artifact can only be exercised from a rather late stage of the object's life, the archivers have to control the creation and consignation of the record. They have to ensure that there is a consignation in a repository, and that the repository will always be, in the words of Michael Moss, a place of dreams, of reenactment, for both the user and the archivist or curator, who together always are engaged, either passively or actively, in the process of refiguration that is never ending. Instead of reenactment, the editors of artists in the archive prefer enactment, because any of the iterations of a work of art, or one may add an archival document, is not a reconstruction or reproduction. Each iteration operates as a living palimpsest and serves to unlock, release and actualize a work's many virtual com and incom possibilities, which the originating instantiation of the work kept in reserve virtually. This is a quote from Henry Lepecki, a performance scholar, but I believe it is true for other artistic endeavors too, as well as for the archivists who are trying to archive digital records. Digital records don't have their content, structure and form in or on a physical medium. They are potential documents, coming into existence only by virtue of software that understands the code to open and use the record. The software sooner or later becomes obsolete, which necessitates refreshing the document through migration or other techniques. The perceptible form of a digital document on your screen is always being manufactured just in time, on the spot. This makes a digital document an ephemeral manifestation. The same is true for digital instantiations of works of art, digital-born or digitized analog materials. I argue that preserving an artwork or an archived document means enacting it by capturing the ephemeron, drawing on the reserves embedded in the originating instantiation of the work or its inception. Further instantiations are what the people at the Rhizome Digital Archive call variants. They will not and cannot be exact copies. They are approximations, if only because the public is not the same as the public at earlier performances. This makes the distinction between original and copy irrelevant to those concerned with performances and livenesses, as Nash and Vaughan argue with regard to digital performance artworks. But it would be also true for digital documents. Moreover, digital software has, as I said, to be refreshed regularly. And at every update, migration or emulation, some elements are changed or even lost. In fact, it is, as Derrida assumed, the mutation in technology changes not simply the archiving process, but what is archivable. That is, the content of what has to be archived is changed by the technology. By choosing a particular digital preservation method, we determined which aspects of digital archives, of digital entities, are to be preserved and which ones will be sacrificed. As Jeff Rothenberg 2 decades ago wrote, we must choose to lose. This affirms what I said before, quoting from the introduction of artists in the archive. Archives are comprised in their continuing and future enactment and use in layers of performance. They are not static, they are constantly refreshed. Oh. Wrong button. They are constantly refreshed, so that the ephemerality endures, to quote Wendy Chun. This enduring ephemerality has been tested, for example, by the Australian Circus Oz Living Archive, founded in 2014 and revived in 2022. This living archive is not merely a digital repository, it is a dynamic part of the mediated enactment of design in and as culture, imagination and articulation. The Circus Oz Living Archive is only one example of the endeavors to preserve works of art by enactment, rather than by freezing a particular instantiation, which traditionally has been seen as a characteristic of the archive. Both archive and artwork may profit from each other. Both artists and archivists may profit from each other. Methods for ensuring authenticity and reliability of multiple artworks can stand as a model for how those qualities can be preserved in digital record systems outside of the arts. That was one of the findings of the task force of Inter Pares, International Research on Permanent Authentic Records in Electronic Systems. In 2008, they published a report on experiential, interactive and dynamic records. Their report discussed, among other things, the preservation of digital media works that combine physical objects, text, audio and moving and still visuals, all interacting with performance and audience. Preserving such works means preserving the ability to perform these works of art, what I call to reenact them. Another finding of Inter Pares was that art practice and theory rarely concern themselves with byproducts of the creative activities, such as the documents that represent the transactional relations of artists and their patrons, commissions, contracts, correspondence, financial records, in other words, the artist's archives. An important component of these archives is what Annette Decker calls documentation as a process. Artwork documentation as a tool for making decisions about the nature of the artwork during its development. These different instantiations by the artist have to be recorded and kept. One could say that an artist creating archives as a work of art at the same time creates archives as the sediment of the artist's transactions and activities. Both the work of art and the artist's archives are ephemeral, especially but not solely those in digital forms. Archiving art entails being more permissive of change of the work of art and the archive, more permissive of the ephemeral performance of art and archive. Anna Decker signals that changing attitudes towards archiving are increasingly focused on ephemerality and require strategies of modulation, movement and mutation. Sarah Jones and Daisy Abbott and Seamus Ross argue that since change is inevitable, perhaps the rhetoric of archive should move away from notions of fixed, stable records. Instead, archivists and artists should allow users and viewers to exploit, perform and participate, and to accept every activation as a celebration of the archive and a work of art. As Marcel Duchamp once said, the creative art is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his or her contribution to the creative art. Thank you very much. Thank you.